The VP's daughter laughed at my gift. It was the sort of laugh designed to echo, bright, practiced, the laugh of someone who measures other people by how well they perform in her spotlight. She called it quaint, then said it looked like costume jewelry. The meeting room, a glass box of strategy decks and clipped smiles, leaned into the joke, like an audience obliging a comedian because the punchline was cheap and the stakes low. Rebecca Hson did not laugh. The ring on her hand was not flashy. It was a plain, dull gold band with a tiny engraved sigil, an almost private thing, worn on the inside of her knuckle because she preferred it hidden from casual eyes. To everyone else, it read as forgettable. To those who knew the language of small emblems, it was intensely readable. Standing at the other end of the oak table, Leela Lang nudged her father's elbow and said, loud enough for everyone, that it looked like something from a flea market, a boutique that sells nostalgia by the gram. Leela had the perfect posture of entitlement, elbows outward, laugh at the ready, phone peeking from her sleeve like an accomplice. Richard Lang, the VP, smiled at the joke as if it were his joke. Around them, colleagues chuckled in the way people do when a hierarchy has chosen who gets to be amusing. Rebecca kept her palms flat on the table and listened. Her face was a careful thing, thin, controlled. The ring caught and threw a little light when she flexed her fingers. That was all. No one in that room understood what they were holding in their hands. Looks like antique jewelry, Rebecca, Leela said. A silk barb. Is that then heirloom or thrift store chic? Either way, tragic. The room laughed. The laugh was soft at first, then grew, like a tide swallowing a shoreline. Rebecca's mouth moved, not into a smile, but into something nearly a preparation for speech. She did not speak. Her silence was small and exact, and it made Leela tilt her head, hunting for reaction. You good? Leela asked, in a voice fake sympathetic enough to be cruel. You look like you could sell that on Etsy. Vintage sorrow. Rebecca's hand tightened by an inch. If her whole life had been an instruction manual, that moment read in sharper font as not combustible, not performative, not a thing for other people to touch. The ring belonged to a family that had learned to make itself invisible by being useful, an ancestry of balance sheets and quiet interventions. Edmund Hson, Rebecca's father, had been the sort of man who rescued troubled companies in midnight phone calls, who bought time for people who burned too bright. He had also gone quiet after a certain point, a retreat that made his name heavier in the quiet corners of finance than it ever had been in the headlines. Leela smirked, waved her hand, and turned the room back into a theater. A dozen lips let out the gentle exhalation of people ready to move on. No one noticed that the motion had not landed, that a pebble had been dropped into a still pond. No one noticed, except the man who would soon stop mid-step. Rebecca's life at Albright and Brandt was steel and habit. She had been hired years ago, not because of polish, but because of competence, the kind that looks like invisibility until something needs fixing. She was operations, scheduling, translating a founder's fog into deadlines, keeping a microscope on the tiny errors that become disasters. Her desk was a map of post-it notes and plain pens, the opposite of Leela's curated chaos. She moved through the office like someone who understood that power prefers not to parade itself, that attention is a temperature that can burn when it rests on the wrong things. On the wall behind her, under the logo that had been printed a little too big for modesty, there was a framed photograph of Malcolm Brandt and Edmund Hson shaking hands at a charity dinner, two older men, both with slow grins. The picture was the outwardly acceptable version of an alliance between money and prudence. No one read the margins of that photograph. After the meeting broke up, people drifted into the usual after-meeting choreography. Laptops snapped shut, exchange of vague promises to follow up, the ritual acknowledgement that nothing had changed. Leela drifted toward the elevator like she moved through the world. Soft steps, loud shoes, already composing a story to post. Rebecca collected her notes and tucked them into a slim leather folder. The ring, as always, was only visible when she raised her hand to tuck hair from behind an ear. The hallway between the boardroom and the elevators had the acoustics of interrogation. It smelled faintly of recycled coffee and expensive perfume. People passed like bookmarks, their lives pressing into the soft fabric of the company's day. That's when the elevator dinged. Elias Rourke walked out of the elevator like a thing that had been built to stop people mid-thought. He had the slow, unhurried gait of someone for whom doors opened in advance. He wore a dark coat, simple, cut to fit a bank vault, shades of gray that suggested wealth practiced and precise. He carried nothing unnecessary. His face was the kind that made you check your own expression in a mirror. Not pretty, but configured for influence. He was a client, one of those names that gets whispered when things need to be done behind the curtain. RK Capital. His presence in the building filled the hallway like a sudden change in temperature. Rebecca was returning to her desk when Rourke stepped out and saw her. For a brief breath, one startled pause he did not bother to hide, his eyes landed on the faint metal at her finger. The movement was so small no one would have noticed it if they'd been counted the breaths. A micro-adjustment, like the recognition of a crest on a coin. He stopped. Everything else in the hallway fell into the background, like a track being muted. People's phones paused mid-swipe. Leela, a few steps ahead and already composing a caption, felt the shift like a breeze and turned her head. Her laugh hung back in her throat. Rourke walked toward Rebecca with the slow certainty of someone approaching a familiar room. He did not smile in the way clients are taught to. Instead, he offered a precise nod, as if greeting a person he had literally kept on file. "You wear that often?" he asked, no irony. His voice had the dry quality of someone who had been in too many boardrooms to make small talk. Rebecca's hand moved in the habitual way of tucking a ring away. "Not for show," she said. The words were small, not defensive. The ring had decades of papers in its small face. It carried decisions like a cargo net. Rourke's mouth thinned. He looked at her, not at the ring first, but at her. Then, like someone who had found a line in an old ledger, he smiled once, a small, private thing. "Edmund Hson," he said. The name landed the way a stone edges the water. Up on the 10th floor, you could hear the ripples. "I thought I'd lost him to the Alps." Rebecca did not answer. Her eyes narrowed a fraction. She had not expected Rourke to know the name. This was the sort of knowledge that traveled in the private circuits of finance, the kind you don't print and don't say aloud at dinner. For the first time since the meeting started, a few people in the hallway looked like they might not be sure which way the room would tilt. Rourke's hand moved, quick and unassuming. He pulled from his wallet a small black card, the sort of thing men with money and no sense of theatricality carry. Heavy, matte, serious. He held it between his fingers and extended it, almost apologetically. "A key," he said, "to a safety deposit. Geneva." Hson used it for things that weren't in the public books. If you think he's vanished, he left instructions in a way he knew would find the right person. Rebecca took the card. Her palm closed around it like someone taking the last piece of a puzzle. There was no stage whisper, no dramatics, just the faint metallic click of the card between her fingers. A receptionist farther down the corridor, someone who'd never met Edmund Hson, cleared her throat, as if to adjust to the new reality. Leela's face had shifted from performance to confusion. Her smile, honed for the camera, froze into the kind of small expression you get when the script changes in the middle of your line. Richard Lang's jaw worked. His posture, always a little too practiced for the job, seemed suddenly like a costume. "Does this mean anything to you?" Rourke asked quietly. Rebecca thought of the man who had been more presence than figure in her life, Edmund, who taught her by quiet example the difference between money that covers damage and money that builds a foundation. She thought of letters folded like maps, of the way he insisted on leaving things in neat envelopes and not in speeches. She thought of the ring, their family sigil, the crest that had saved settlements without fanfare. "It means there are papers," she said. It was true and not the whole truth. It was enough. Rourke lowered his voice. "If you ever need someone to move a ledger," he said, "I know how to read them." There were consequences in that sentence, but they were not spelled out. Rourke's presence was a vector, an outside force that understood the language of some things and, importantly, recognized signs others dismissed as negligible. That recognition was itself a power. Rebecca felt it slide across the skin on the back of her neck, like someone placing a hand there to steady her. The ring was suddenly a signal, not to Leela, but to someone who used signals to navigate. He stepped back into the elevator with a courtesy that made you aware of the fact he could have stayed and rewritten everything. The doors slid shut, and the corridor exhaled. By the time the elevator dinged again on the next floor, the office had a new rumor germinating, small, quick, like a sprout through concrete. People clustered around monitors and whispered in the cafeterias. Phones that had been scrolling now stopped on headlines from the past and private names. The scent of roasted coffee became sharper, as if the world wanted to be awake for the change. Leela went back to her desk with fingers shaking just enough for someone attentive to notice. She had practiced contempt so long she'd forgotten how to hold surprise. Rebecca walked back to her station and sat down like a woman resuming a chess game mid-move. The ring seemed heavier now, not from weight but from information. She set the black card down beside her keyboard and opened a drawer that smelled faintly of talc and old paper. There were contacts in the back of her drawer, names her father used to use for the things he did without press releases. They were wrapped in plain envelopes and labeled in handwriting that made something like a map. She did not call loudly. She did not tell anyone. That is not how the Hsons worked. Her first move was to the secure terminal in the archive room, the kind of device compliance pretended only IT used. It was a small, windowless place off the service corridor, where the lights were dim and the hum of the building sounded like an engine running steady. She slid the black card into the slot of the reader there as if sliding an old key into a lock. A soft LED blinked green. The terminal hummed in acceptance and then presented a login prompt with the sort of courtesy only machines have. Rebecca typed a username she had not used in years and a passphrase that smelled faintly of lemon and elderwood, the kind of mnemonic Edmund favored. The screen offered a single folder titled Hson's Legacy. Inside were words you could not print in a headline without context. Sealed ledger, contingency concord, clause 3A.
There were also line items, blandly labeled, that had the tone of somebody cataloging a history of favors and guarantees. Balance transfers, escrowed capital, a small line that said, reserved, discretionary intervention, Albright and Brandt, legal. Rebecca did not read the ledger like someone noticing a ledger. She read it like someone reading a map that ends in an X. The entries were dry, dates, amounts, short notes in a tight hand. But beneath the dryness, there was motion. Capital moved quietly on nights when it would hurt the least. Funds rerouted through accounts with names that did not exist in public records. Instructions to freeze decisions if certain signatures or directives were attempted without compliance approval. She paused on one line that referenced a clause none of the general counsel at Albright and Brandt would know by name. A protective stipulation placed in the founding trust in the name of Hson heirs. An invisible legal shutter that could be activated if the family's capital or name were threatened by internal maneuvers. It was written in the ledger as almost an afterthought, but in the margin her father had scrawled a single word: defender. Rebecca felt the logic of the ledger like a hand on her back. It was not a weapon, it was a failsafe. Edmund had always made room for precision over spectacle. The ledger was his way of making the world account for itself. At the elevator, the building's receptionist, a woman named Trina who preferred not to be surprised by anything, was on the phone when a courier arrived, a man in a nondescript coat bearing a square box with a red wax seal. He checked the recipient list and asked for the board secretary. The secretary, who kept her nails long and her emails perfectly formatted, took the box and readied the nameplate on the envelope for the chairwoman's office. A wax seal with a crest pressed into it waited under the courier's hand like some old-world punctuation. Word ran faster than people realize in a company. The courier's arrival was a punctuation mark. Murmurs reached the cafeteria. A junior analyst peered over a monitor. "Did you see who came?" someone asked. "Work was here," another said. "There's a sealed box for the board," came the reply. People traded notes like contraband. Leela hovered at her desk, watching Rebecca cross the open plan as if willing a scene to become a drama. Her fingers twitched, then she tapped a note into the group chat, an emoji, something that would look like bravado. But someone else replied with plain text: "Chairwoman Delgado has a sealed envelope. Don't touch the board packet." The news had gravity now. Sealed envelope. It meant formal things. It meant someone had decided to push paper to the highest place and let the institution decide. Rebecca did not go to the boardroom. She did not want to be seen. She had never wanted to be the spectacle. She folded herself into the stacks of cubicles and watched the building reorient. People moved in little arcs of curiosity and fear. HR checked the calendar. Compliance opened a file and clicked through disclaimers with the visible aversion of someone who has read too many contracts and never wants more. Back in the archive, the directory of the ledger contained another reference, a name, Malcolm Brandt, with a note that suggested a line of credit had been called upon once to avert a public scandal, and the documentation of that call resided in the vault. The ledger implied a relationship older than the company's glossy PR could suggest. It read, in the kind of shorthand that hints at grudging respect, like the fossilized base of an old structure. Rebecca breathed in. There was a procedure, protocols her father had taught, the bones of quiet activism that did not need publicity to work. The ledger did not instruct her to destroy anyone.
It offered options, safe corridors where accountability could be invoked through paperwork, through shareholders' rights, and an obscure clause no one wanted to read aloud. Her first move was to send a single encrypted note, not to her father, he did not answer, but to an old compliance officer who had known Edmund by name and knew how to make things visible without making them violent. The message was short and precise. Look into frontline payments. Check Lang's approvals 9/11 this quarter. Confidential. The reply came back in a day's minutes. On it, the compliance officer wrote, "There are anomalies, flagging now." An anomaly is not a verdict. It is a cold spot on a scan. It is the first place the scanner tells you something may be wrong. In the hands of someone like Rebecca, anomalies were maps. Meanwhile, across a lobby on a different floor, Rourke had not called reporters. He had not posted anything. He had, very quietly, called one of the bank's trust officers and asked for the particulars of the vault where the ledger sat. His pull on the system was not dramatic. It did not have the flair of a dramatic villain. It was precise, surgical. He began to enact what his firm called due diligence, a phrase that in some firms means polite snooping, and in others means programmatic disassembly. Rourke had a language for both. Out in the open plan, Leela pressed her fingers to the table and opened a group chat that said, "Plot twist?" She meant it sarcastically, but the room's tension turned the sarcasm brittle. The professionals nearest the situation were not joking. There was an electricity behind their quiet, the kind of electricity that only forms when paperwork becomes dangerous. The courier left the sealed box in the chairwoman's office with the discretion of someone who knew envelopes could start fires. Chairwoman Delgado took the box with her hands steady enough to be trained. She placed it in the cabinet behind her chair and locked it, keys clinking. Later, when she opened it, the wax broke and paper slid out like a folded story. But that was not yet. For now it sat, patient and unread, like a sleeping thing. Between the ledger and the envelope, rumor became a presence. It moved like a shadow under a door, and where it passed, colleagues began to speak in lower voices. HR looked up from a spreadsheet. The general counsel, Karen, put down a pen and trained a small, professional smile that read, "I know a problem when I see one." Alan from compliance, who liked order more than most people liked coffee, sent a message to Jenna with the subject line, "Possible trigger, Hson legacy files, please review." Rebecca kept working. She did not let her mind become the site of speculation. She moved through lists and checkboxes, her hands steady over the keyboard. She opened a secure line and checked the ledger for the clause code her father had always muttered about in the old days when they thought privacy was a matter of the household. 3A. There it was, a line in the ledger that referenced the founding trust, sealed with a notary stamp and a code. To the outsider, it read as a dry legal protection. To someone who had sat on the terms of agreements for 40 years, it read like a slow-closing trapdoor that could be opened to protect family interest when internal actors attempted to pressure or marginalize heirs. Rebecca did not grin. She did not rejoice. She felt the ledger's architecture like a muscle memory she had inherited. It offered her options that involved law and procedure and thresholds. These were not illusions of grandeur. They were levers, structural and boring, and therefore effective. But levers do not move themselves. Someone has to pull. In the meantime, the Langs began to rearrange the deck chairs. Richard Lang kept his phone too close to his ear and his smiles too wide. He asked his assistant to prepare a memo to clarify governance expectations. Leela, who lived in a world where a social feed could reshape public memory, posted a photo of herself in the corridor with a caption about Monday energy and tagged half the office. The comments were bland. Something in the air made faux peppy responses sound like apologies. Elias Work's visit had been brief, but it had disarranged things in the way a hand rearranges pieces on a chessboard by moving 2 squares and forcing reactions not yet imagined. The black card she had taken from his hand sat heavy in Rebecca's desk. There were names in its memory and coordinates to a vault. That information, mobilized, would cause ripples. Some of those ripples would be dangerous to people who trafficked influence as if it were a currency cheaper than litigation. That night, after the office lights went down and the glow of monitors softened, Rebecca stayed. She made a pot of coffee and sat in the archive room. The LED at the terminal pulsed gently. Her father's ledger was a dry thing, but dry did not mean harmless. She printed nothing. She made a list, like a scientist noting variables. Names, dates, approvals. She circled one line, Lang, and underlined it. Her phone buzzed once. It was a message from a ghost of her childhood. A line of text from someone in a city 2 time zones away. "Is your father alive?" it read. The message carried more questions than answers. Rebecca put the phone upside down and returned to the ledger. The emblem at the edge of the ring caught the light again. A small, private flash. It made something like a promise, and something like a threat. She thought of the founding documents, those hidden things people swear by when they want to make institutions do the clean thing. Edmund's clause would not strike like lightning. It would work subtly, by paperwork and precedent. It would put protections in place and call attention to attempts at marginalization. It would begin a slow, bureaucratic accounting that was in its own way terrifying to people who preferred to operate in daylight, but without witness. The office next morning hummed with the kind of quiet that preceded action. People came to desks like soldiers to posts. Rumors had sharpened into suggestions of audits, of compliance hits, of board inquiries. The sealed box on Delgado's shelf had been moved closer to the center, as if it were a weight to be considered. Rebecca had a plan that, in its simplest form, relied on things that could be documented. No vendettas, no show trials, just the mechanics of corporate governance, leveraged the way a locksmith uses pins. She tapped a message into her encrypted line. Activate old channels. Quiet. Compliance only. No announcements. She did not tell Malcolm Brandt, because some things are better learned at the top when the time is right, but she knew that he would be notified if and when the board had to convene. Malcolm Brandt, the founder whose shadow hung over every conference room carpet, preferred names to be tied to actions. He liked tangible solutions. He had the sort of temperament that could be mollified by paperwork and logic. That was why Rebecca believed the ledger would find a sympathetic ear when it needed one. Days move fast in offices, and slow in consequences. By midday, whispers had hardened into calls. Alan had pulled a compliance memo and forwarded it to Karen with the subject line, "Urgent Review." Karen, an elegant woman who never let her penless hand betray impatience, called in a quiet meeting with Chairwoman Delgado, her voice the kind of low that Madeleine Albright used in diplomacy, precise, unavoidable. In a private room, Delgado broke the wax seal on the board envelope. The papers inside were old and smelled like a library in summer. There were signatures in ink that had dried into intent. The documents read like a founding myth. Obligations, guarantees, the word reserved used in paragraphs like a promise to be used only under certain conditions. There was Clause 3A, typed and notarized, the legal equivalent of a slow-acting lock. Delgado did not read the clause aloud. She read it and then set the documents on the table with the quiet gravity of someone who had put down an object of weight. She called the general counsel and compliance and the founder. She asked them to come to the boardroom in 40 minutes. Her face remained neutral. Her eyes, when they looked at each person, did not need to scold. They simply told the room they would be hearing things they might not like. Someone in HR texted Leela to please report to the chair's office. The message read like an assignment, not a punishment. Leela's breath came faster, and her hands flew like someone trying to catch a ball they can't see. She looked at her father, who attempted a smile that did not hide the fact his morning had become a geometry problem in which his daughter had the wrong angles. Rebecca, standing away from the spectacle by design, watched the office align itself like dominoes. She did not celebrate. She only allowed herself the small acknowledgement that paper could do what gossip could not. Paper carried authority. It could constrict and protect in the same motion. At her desk, the black card had been placed in the top right drawer like a sleeping animal. She slid the drawer shut, as if to test whether closing it would silence the future. The phone on her desk buzzed again. Another message, from a name she trusted in Geneva. "We have a sealed ledger ready to be released. Are you an authorized claimant?" She placed her fingertips to the ring and let them rest there, as if the metal were a compass. The ledger willing itself into daylight would change the motion of many careers. It would force people to sign their names to what had been done. It would perhaps call some men to account. It would also offer a path for her to ensure that whatever power she might inherit would be used to make the company stable, not to feed egos. For a moment, she imagined Leela standing in the center of the boardroom, while Malcolm Brandt folded his hands and watched. She imagined the colors of failure, Leela's carefully applied makeup running from the heat of embarrassment, Richard Lang's attempts at poise crumbling like a set of cards. The picture satisfied no private joy in her.
It was the picture of alignment, where an institution corrected itself by its own mechanisms. Then Work's card flashed in her mind, the small black rectangle he had handed in the hallway. She thought of the velvet boxes Edmund liked to use for small shipments, the way his handwriting had a habit of delivering verdicts in safe envelopes. She thought of how a single small object could reorder a corporation if placed in the right hands. Before the boardroom could reconvene, something else happened, something quiet and surgical. A compliance analyst named Jenna pulled a series of scanned invoices and found a string of approvals signed by Richard Lang.
At first, they looked like normal authorizations. Then she saw the dates, and then the recipients' names, the kind of shell accounts that were used in corporate finance to route money through permissible channels. The sums were not theatrical. They were efficient. The patterns, once plotted, suggested someone who had used process as camouflage. Jenna closed her mouth, then typed an email with attachments and a subject line, "Possible irregular approvals, for review." She sent it to Karen, Alan, and the board. She attached the ledger screenshots she had been allowed to access with an internal request. The images were small, annotated, and unassuming. When Karen opened the email, her eyes moved like a metronome. She called Delgado within minutes. The room they assembled in smelled of shared espresso and the faint metallic tang of stress. Delgado placed the ledger and the approvals on the table like evidence. No one made a speech. They did the thing their jobs required. They looked at paper and connected it to consequence. The word recusal might be whispered. The word auditable would be said in objective tones. The room tilted toward action because the documents demanded it. Outside the boardroom, the office felt like an organism waiting for direction. Phones began to ring. Messages zipped like nervous birds. The rumor had teeth now. Rebecca stayed off the stage except where necessary. She did not want credit. She wanted correction. She wanted the system to realign without the cruelty of spectacle. That was why she had never made herself public. Because power, when uncoupled from responsibility, tends to breed a kind of theatricality that destroys institutions rather than mending them. Later that day, fashionably late as always, Malcolm Brand arrived in the boardroom wearing the expression of a man who had been handed a surprise but knew his part. He took the papers, read them in that slow way of old men who have been forced to read uncomfortable truths, and then looked up at the group. There was a pause, an ordinary silence that is often louder than any speech. Brandt's eyes, the kind that had signed a dozen deals and 100 dinner checks, dropped to the ring on Rebecca's hand when she entered the room. The ring was where it had always been, unassuming, unperformed. He did not comment out loud. He merely sat as if making space for the moment to arrive. When the board asked questions, Rebecca answered in small, precise truths. She did not embellish. She did not deliver a vindictive monologue. She explained clerical steps, process failures, the ledger's existence, and the clause that could be invoked to protect an heir from internal maneuvers that contrived to remove them without proper cause. Her voice was even, the sentences economical. Leela sat in the back then, a bright bloom of wrongness in a room built for somber decisions. She had been asked to come in under the pretense of a clarifying conversation.
Instead, she found herself in a room full of adults who had swallowed the joke she had tried to tell and decided it was time for measurement. Leela's courage, like most curated things, was brittle outside a camera's frame. No one burst into applause. This was not a play. There was only the accumulation of documents and the way they pressed against excuses. When the board considered the ledger and Clause 3A, it became a thing that could be parsed in a meeting. Legal counsel read excerpts. Karen explained the chain of approvals that had been bypassed. Alan from compliance talked about the pattern of approvals that indicated someone had been using policy as a veneer. At one point, Richard Lang rose to speak, and for a moment the room smelled of cheap cologne and slippery confidence. He attempted a defense that sounded rehearsed. They all had rehearsed. He insisted there had been miscommunication, that emails were misread, that no intent could be ascribed without evidence. The room listened with the coolness of people whose jobs were to weigh numbers and signatures and nothing else. Rebecca watched him. She did not want him publicly humiliated. She wanted the truth. She wanted structures to do their work. When the chairwoman called for a short recess to allow the legal team to convene, Lang's shoulders dropped in the small, private way of a man who has realized that his runway is closing. Out in the hallway, people stared and made their own calculus. Leela, escorted by a pale HR representative, tried one last time to find an angle for performance. She turned to Rebecca and said with a voice sharpened by panic, "You think you're better than me?" Her question was not rhetorical. She wanted a reaction. Rebecca looked at her as if looking at a child with a new toy. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said quietly. "I think systems should do what they claim. I think people should be held to what they signed for." Her words were not cruel. They were exact. Someone later would call her merciless. Others would call her disciplined.
She simply closed her hands and unslipped the ring from her finger. It slid into her palm with the quiet of something returning home. She didn't display the ring. She placed it in a small velvet box she kept in her pocket for reasons even she didn't fully explain. It felt like a symbol being put to rest. For the first time since the insult in the meeting, Leela looked genuinely off balance. Out in the corridors, a different sound began. Phones ringing, messages, a sense of procedure starting its slow machinery. Rourke, who had not been seen since the elevator, called his office and asked for a transfer of funds. Nothing dramatic, a routine check. But the ledger's existence created a fracture. If the paper triggered a review, any movement of capital by Rourke's team might have to answer to a new set of eyes. He could, of course, pull funds. He could, in theory, make the ledger talk by moving money in plain sight. But Rourke was careful, and his moves were meant to be surgical. That night, in a private corner office where the founder kept his cognac and his grudges, Malcolm Brand opened the velvet box Rebecca had placed on the table earlier, not to accept an offer, but to handle an object with the respect it demanded. He looked at the ring and then at Rebecca, who had not come to collect a title. The ring was a device that signified connection, not power. "You came to do a job," he said, his voice not unkind. Rebecca placed a hand on the box. "I came to make sure truth had a path, not a prize." Malcolm eyed her for a long minute. He understood, in ways that years in the same room teach, that institutions do not always align themselves with justice without someone willing to be patient. He also knew that power is seductive. He offered what the room often offers those who have shown competence, a seat at the table. He would later offer specifics, authority, a board seat, the ability to direct oversight. Rebecca did not take it then. She did not need titles to make the system answer. Titles are dresses people swap when they want power to be visible. She folded her hands, the ring inside the box feeling like a quiet verdict. Outside the glass, the night had a certain crispness. The lobby lights glowed. The city had a wire of its own. Newsrooms, feeds, the low hum of watchers seeking drama. Inside, the company had been realigned, through paper and patience and an unexpected recognition in a hallway. It was not over, not by a long margin. There were more decisions to be made. There would be claims and counters, legal briefs and retentions, and PR statements that pretended these were minor headaches. There would be a period where things felt chaotic because the machine of correction requires noise to function. People with reputations to protect would try to write the current episode as a misunderstanding. Leela would try to shape her narrative. Richard Lang would attempt to salvage dignity with a press release about differences and operational lapses. But there was another change that mattered more than any statement. Someone powerful had noticed the ring and had the patience to follow the paper trail. That intersection, an heirloom with a ledger with a clause, was the axis on which a certain kind of reckoning would turn. It was bureaucratic, not theatrical. It would not be an act of poetic justice. It would be a slow, relentless application of what the institution's own language required. In the corridor, a janitor paused with a stack of folders and looked at a woman walking out of the building, Leela, led by HR, looking smaller than the internet had made her feel all morning. In the elevator, a few floors above, Rourke's coat brushed the handrail like a man who understood that sometimes leverage is not force, but recognition.
In a dim archive room, a compliance analyst put a name on a folder and taped it shut with a strip of clear tape, like sealing a found relic. She wrote "Lang Approvals" on the label in block letters, then slid the folder into a box stamped "Audit." The box made a small sound as it hit the table, the same sound a gavel makes when something that used to be plausible is no longer. Inside the boardroom, chairs scraped. The projector hummed and went quiet. Delgado folded the documents back into their envelope with an almost tender care, as if paper could be persuaded to behave by the gentleness of its reader. Karen, legal's voice, calm and precise, read a passage of Clause 3A aloud, not for theater, but so there would be a shared record. Her phrasing was deliberate. Quote, "Reserved protections for heirs upon attempts of undue marginalization, contingent on audit confirmation and board review." The words landed like a metronome. They organized the room into accounts and consequences. Alan, from compliance, who had the look of a man who slept with spreadsheets under his pillow, tapped a tablet and brought up the attachment Jenna had sent. On the screen were lines and dates and 3 signatures repeated where there should have been 1. The pattern was not elegant. It was efficient. Approvals routed through shell entities, invoices that matched work orders with no deliverables. It was the sort of administrative choreography someone had rehearsed until it felt like a policy. Richard Lang, who had once been able to speak at conferences without a misstep, felt his throat dry. He stood and placed his hands on the table as if to steady himself, the way people brace before announcements they don't want to make. "For the record," he began, and his voice was used to being the voice that closed rooms. "These are accounting anomalies. There are signatures," Karen interrupted. "There are approvals attributed to you. There are beneficiaries with names that do not appear on any operational charts. That is not a clerical error. That is a pattern." The room did not need to explode into accusations. Paper and policy do the exploding for you. Brant watched, quietly assessing, the way a man who'd built a firm on temperament reads temperament back. Outside, the phones in the trading desks began their little panic warbles. Rourke, who never acted like a man seeking spectacle, had already spoken to his counsel. He had asked for, and had been granted, a temporary withdrawal of his firm's commitments pending clarity on governance. The effect was immediate in the firm's corridors. Vendors called. 2 scheduled payments were put on hold. Markets do not like unresolved governance. Neither do creditors. Lang had miscalculated the temperature of his game. He had thought the firm's inertia was an ally. He had treated approval chains like speed bumps. He'd practiced the art of plausible deniability until it replaced his conscience.
The ledger's quiet rose had a way of exposing men who had confused procedure for protection. Delgado called for an immediate ethics committee meeting. She said nothing about firing. She wanted the room to convene around data rather than spectacle, but everyone in that room could see the direction the data pointed. HR had already done its part. An email delivered to Leela's inbox read, simply and without flourish, "Please meet with the chair's office immediately." It did not say, "You are being removed." It said enough. The company practiced courtesy the way other institutions practiced reserve, a little cruelty dressed as decorum. When Leela was escorted to the chair's office, her public persona had become a small, sharp thing. She had imagined cameras and sympathetic op-eds. Instead, she found fluorescent lights and a door that had 2 locks. The HR rep who accompanied her had hands that moved like someone who'd learned to respond to tears and tantrums without offering either. Back in the boardroom, Brant asked a single question that functioned like a probe. Did anyone here otherwise benefit from these approvals? People shifted. Lang's assistant's eyes flicked to the floor. Someone whispered that a vendor in Cyprus had made a delivery 2 days before the contract. Someone else said that a social event credit had been approved under a different cost center. The ledger's tendrils touched a number of innocents and a number of complicities. This was the thing institutions fear, a checklist that pulls in more checkboxes. Brant's response was succinct. He called for immediate suspension of signatory powers for Richard Lang pending the investigation. It was not a sentence most CEOs speak lightly. It was one Brant spoke because he knew the firm could not be cleansed by rumor. It must be cleansed by procedure. Later that day, security escorted Richard Lang from his office. It was not cinematic, it was bureaucratic. He was handed a document that explained the temporary suspension, a notice that requested no public comment, and a bag tag for his personal effects. He signed with the shaky grace of someone who had been practiced at controlling rooms and found the room controlling him. Leela's exit was quieter, an HR hand on her elbow, the soft clink of a key across her phone as she tried to call someone who would make the morning different. She looked back at the glass facade as if at a reflection that no longer matched her. Outside, people watched and whispered, the way an audience does when the play they were enjoying turns into a procedural manual. Rebecca watched all of it from the margins she had chosen. She did not experience joy. She felt an intense professional satisfaction the way a surgeon feels relief when a wound is finally explored and the source of infection found. She had not come to watch people fall. She had come to make the institution function as advertised.
In the days that followed, Jenna and Alan stitched the evidence together with the slow artistry of someone making a tapestry out of spreadsheets. Notifications were sent to auditors. An independent firm was retained. The board convened emergency sessions. There were statements drafted about governance reviews and the firm's commitment to transparency. The public relations team, who normally built narratives like cake decorators, began to prepare messages for a world that loves scandal. Brant insisted on restraint. Elias Rourke, who had the capacity to score the firm in ways people feared to imagine, moved cautiously but not timidly. He had not come to make a spectacle. He had come to make sure the ledger's protections were honored, in the way his trust believed they should be, discreetly and with teeth. His temporary withdrawal of funding was leverage. It was intended to push the firm to use its own rules to correct itself. It worked. As compliance dug deeper, a series of memos surfaced that made the case harder to defend. They showed that Lang had overridden internal thresholds with approving emails passed through junior staff. They showed that certain vendors had been paid for services that were never actually provided, a software upgrade that left the system unchanged, a consultation that produced no minutes, an event billed to a marketing budget that never happened. Each paper placed another finger on the scale. A minor, human thing made the case undeniable. Someone had stamped an invoice with Leela's initials in a handwriting sample that matched her signature, an attempt to tie the work to an executive sponsor. Someone else had left a receipt in a tax folder where it did not belong. These small mistakes, part ego, part sloppiness, were what institutions needed, breadcrumbs to follow. On a gray Tuesday, the board convened for an extraordinary session. Malcolm Brandt sat at the head of the table with the velvet box Rebecca had left in his office earlier that late beside his hand. The ring sat there like a small question, quiet and unassuming. He looked at it and then at Rebecca, who had come into the room because there was no way she could act without being present when the institution decided on consequences. When the board read the evidence, Richard Lang was recused from any vote about disciplinary measures. The board voted, in close consultation with legal counsel, to terminate his employment for cause. The motion was procedural and final. There is a particular sound an organization makes when it breaks with a past it had not wanted to face. Chairs slide, phones put on silent, names cross thresholds. The firm offers Leela the option to resign. She refused. They offered to buy out her contract. She refused. In the end, the firm made the administrative choice to terminate, with immediate effect, on grounds of policy violation and failure of fiduciary responsibility. HR escorted her out mid-afternoon while the firm handled the necessary paperwork.
There were calls, a small legal wrangle, and later a terse statement that summarized the firm's actions in the dry, careful language of corporate press. When they were gone, the office felt like a stage after the actors leave. Props scattered, scripts half-read, and the lights still on. People went back to their desks like people who had been watching a storm, and now, while the wind was still gusty, began to count what had been broken. The founder, Malcolm Brandt, turned to Rebecca with the sort of offer that can sound like both gratitude and containment, a seat on the oversight committee. It was, in practice, a way to give her authority and to bind her into the firm's bureaucracy, making her part of the thing she had come to audit. He offered it with the pragmatism of a man who understood that competence must be folded into governance to be protective. "You've done what needed doing," he said. "The board could use you. We could use your eye." Rebecca placed her hand on the velvet box. The ring lay inside like a patient answer. She lifted the lid, not with the flourish of ceremony, but with the almost mechanical motion of someone who knows the weight of objects and the meanings people give them. When she placed the ring in Brandt's palm, he looked at it as if he expected it to narrate a past in a voice he recognized. Instead, it was only metal and a small engraved sigil, nothing more than the humility of an emblem that had been worn to remind someone of a promise, not to advertise it. "I don't want a title," she said. Her voice had the soft, deliberate quality Karen used in depositions. "I want the firm to do what it says it will. A seat is not justice. A structure that works is." Brandt hesitated the way men do when faced with a logic they respect, but a consequence they did not plan to accept. He had spent a lifetime acquiring ways to keep a firm together. Faces to appoint, committees to convene. He knew, in the particular way old men do, that the best action is often not the one that flatters your ego. He could have insisted. He could have made the offer sound like an honor and a bribe simultaneously. He did not. Instead, he folded his hands and met her eyes with a look that seemed to say he understood she had given him something other than servitude. He saw that she was not asking for power. She was offering them a chance to behave like an institution. He listened, and he let the paper do its work. The office's cleanup took its time. There were interviews and subpoenas and vendor statements and the steady, unromantic movement of files across desks. There were lawyers who adjusted their cuffs, and PR people who drafted statements that read like apologies without adjectives. There were rumors about who else might be implicated, stories about deals done over cigars, and speculation about clients who might be upset. The world outside loved drama. The inside loved order. Both got what they wanted in their own ways.
Throughout it all, Rebecca remained measured. She never smiled in triumph. When people called her cold, she accepted the label without defense, because she knew the value of detachment when a system needs correction rather than revenge. She let the processes do what processes do: identify, verify, adjudicate. Elias Rook returned for one more meeting before cutting ties permanently with any executive who tried to game governance in that firm. He asked Brandt plain questions about the board's commitment to oversight. He did not gloat. He simply laid out conditions for restoring confidence: an independent review every quarter, a public reporting mechanism for audit results, a purge of named signatory permissions until the board certified new controls. His terms were stern but practical, intended to replace the culture of plausible deniability with a culture of traceable authority. Rebecca read his terms and nodded. They aligned with the ledger's spirit: accountability by structure.
She felt satisfaction in the same practical way she did when a protocol she had designed for a supply chain prevented a delay. It was not about applause, it was about function. When Brant reopened the velvet box later that evening, the ring was there. He turned it in his fingers like a man who had been given both a token and a question. He thought, briefly and privately, about the man who had written Clause 3A in an old hand and had expected the world to honor paperwork even if it could not honor headlines. He thought about promises kept in the dark for reasons that had nothing to do with fame. "You weren't looking for an heir," he said to Rebecca in the hush of the office after hours. "You were looking for a steadying agent." Rebecca packed a small bag that night. She had been offered a seat at the table and refused. She could take credit, she could take title, she could be visible. But the ledger and her father had taught her something else, that sometimes the clearest power is the one that makes the institution do the thing it promised. She preferred that power to the theatrical kind. Her resignation, if that is what it was framed as a request for a sabbatical, a move that allowed the firm to keep the form of the offer alive without making her a fixture there. Brant accepted with reluctance and something like relief. The firm needed new faces in the oversight committee and a narrative of reform that included them. She had given them what they needed and then removed herself from its center. On her last morning, she walked the building once more, as if to measure what had changed. The air smelled of fresh coffee and the tang of urgent emails. People passed her with eyes lowered or with new civility. Some nodded, which was new. Some whispered. A few smiled uncertainly, as if measuring whether gratitude would be forgiven. Near the reception, Trina, the receptionist, handed her a paper cup of coffee with a small knowing smile. "For the road," Trina said.
Rebecca nodded. It was the kind of thanks she accepted without fuss. Leela was gone. Lang was gone. The firm had been shaken, its lines redrawn. Whether it would remain reformed or slip back into old comforts over time was an open question. Institutions are made of people, and people have short memories. Rebecca knew that. That was why she had not claimed a throne. She had made the mechanisms work and then stepped back. Outside, the city moved on. Headlines would come, then fade. Fingers would wag. The firm's stock would tick. The real work, the slow rebuilding of trust, the mundane task of tightening approval loops, would be the real measure of change. It would be tedious. It would also be necessary. She stopped at the founder's office door. Malcolm Brant sat with the velvet box open on his desk. He watched her without theatrics, the way a man who'd been tested looks at someone who had helped him survive a test. "You did this with paper and patience," he said. "I did it with what I inherited," she answered. She did not say the ledger was more than paper. She did not say her father's absence felt like proof of both generosity and danger. She left the nuance unsaid. She closed the door behind her and walked out into the lobby where the glass caught the morning light. A young analyst looked up and hurried to greet a client. A florist delivered a box of orchids to HR, false cheer in a time that needed facts. The building's hum had a new cadence, less blithe, more aware. Rebecca stepped into a cab without fanfare. She put the black card back into her wallet. She let the ring rest in its velvet box until she found a place for it she could not yet name. The world would move, so would she. From the plate glass windows, Brant watched her cab pull away. The velvet box sat open beside his hand like a small insolent proof that someone else had come into his life and demanded the thing his company claimed it was. He thought, with a complexity that made him younger in the moment, that she had been less of an heir than an instrument. She had not collected power, she had applied pressure. The firm would, for a while, be on its best behavior. For a while, audits would be robust and vendor reviews thorough. Rook's withdrawal had the effect of focus. But institutions are not virtue machines. They are communities of compromise. The ledger's protections would help, but only if people sustained the diligence Rebecca had modeled. In the end, what Rebecca wanted was not a headline. It was a system that matched its promises. She wanted the kind of work that outlives a viral moment. She wanted accountability that outlasted a scandal. As the cab merged into traffic, the narrator, who had watched from the margins all along, lets one observation land. It is a peculiar thing to be mistaken for the prize when you are actually the mechanism that makes prizes mean something. People wanted tokens. Institutions needed audits. In the founder's office, Brant closed the velvet box, the ring inside like a small, heavy truth. He let the lid fall and sat back. The phones on his desk began to ring, one by one. People needed to be called. Statements needed to be drafted. The firm had work to do.
She had left the ring. She had left the ledger in motion. She had left a company to do its own labor. And when someone later asked who had started the change, Brant would tell them, with the grudging respect of a man who knows when to thank talent and when to trust process, that she hadn't come for honor. She wasn't the heir. She was the audit.